Maya Hari, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you, Lynn. Pleasure to be here.
Do you think that Twitter is a force for good or evil?
Twitter is certainly a force for good. Has always been. Whether it's been a flooding in Jakarta, whether it's been a young girl in Manila who got discovered because she painted her dress and it was her graduation dress and suddenly became someone that was coveted overnight. Whether it's a little boy in New Delhi who was homeless and separated from his parents during COVID and got reunited because there was a public platform like Twitter to be able to connect. We're a platform that has always stood for that, has stood for being able to enable the right voices, whether it's Greta Thunberg and her movement around climate strike, or it is freedom of speech movements and democratic movements around the world. We've always been a force for good.
Let's take President Trump. Everybody knows that you banned him from Twitter, and it's a permanent ban. Why did it take you so long? He was 4 years president. He was fairly inflammatory during the entire period. And only towards the end of his tenure did you actually say, okay, well, no more.
Well, I think as a platform, we have a responsibility to serve the public conversation. And we have always, over the years, made sure that that information that is worth getting out to users should always have a voice and a place on the platform. We're constantly looking at making sure the policies evolve with time. And one of the things that we're very careful about is when content on the platform starts to potentially affect offline harm. And this is an area where we found, with the account of real Donald Trump, we saw this essentially play out in a way where there was glorification of violence happening. And it's the same policy that we hold a regular average Joe on the platform accountable, me, you, accountable in the same policies as that particular account.
You say that the rules that you apply on incitement to violence and all these various other things are applied with equal, sort of say, rigor, regardless of whether it's, an average Joe, as you say, or it's a president. But a lot of people would say that's not true. I mean, obviously, celebrities get away with saying all sorts of things, or it appears that way.
I actually think that the way we apply our policies is very consistent. Now, there are certain personalities in positions of power, or journalists, or political personalities, that we do have a certain framework because we think that users deserve to hear what these people say. But whether it is a personality like that or an average Joe, when it comes to things like offline harm or violence, the rules apply equally.
But sometimes you won't know that it's going to be offline harm until the, so to say, offline harm, in other words, real life hurt, somebody actually getting killed, happens. I mean, it took the rioting on Capitol on January the 6th, with people actually dying, for the ban to come in on Donald Trump.
Well, I think the signals, and we look at patterns of repeated application of glorification of violence, for instance. And we look at our rule book and apply that same set of principles. So if there's a tweet that actually violates any one of our rules, we'll actually label it in this instance when it comes from a personality in the context of an election. And we'll label that, and we'll label it a few times. And when we see a repeated pattern there, we proceed to the next level of escalation there, which in this instance of this account was a ban.
Can you give us some idea of what these rules are, in the sense that how do you assess whether or not this person is beginning to say really dangerous things?
Right, so our policy approach tends to be, think about it like an evolving book. In that sense, as we learn more from users, as we learn more from civic society, we start to evolve that process. So think about, we instituted last year COVID information policy, and through that we actually used AI as well as human intervention, but we actually addressed about nearly 5 million tweets where the content was either spammy or bordered on misinformation. We've rolled out a feature called as Birdwatch. And what we're doing is we're actually trying to enroll the power of the community to be able to say, hey, let me add note, or let me add a little context to this tweet that you're seeing. I think maybe that this represents a certain amount of misinformation in my opinion, and let me add a little note there for you to read. And over time, you start to get the power of multiple people either upvoting a certain note or not, but also we start to ask the community to rate the intensity of the harm that this misinformation might create. And so that's sort of a good example of saying, how do we bring in the power of technology, and how do we bring in the human review, and use the power of both of those to evolve how our policies and apply how our policies are enforced.
What about the case of Myanmar now?
What goes on today in Myanmar with the block of the internet and services, digital services in the market, definitely concerns us in a very significant way. We truly deeply believe in wanting to give consumer choice, but also to have citizens around the world, including Myanmar, have their voice heard in the way that they would choose to have it heard.
So what would you say to the military junta who say, no, this is a question of security. It is safer not to have your inflammatory discussions on Twitter?
I think it's a question of allowing free speech and enabling free speech in the current scenario. It's a question of making sure that that is done in a way that people come together and have a conversation on things that matter. Of course, if there is a question of violence and threat to safety, that gets taken into account as well. But I think the first and fundamental piece is that open internet and that concept is under threat, and that concerns us significantly in this scenario.
So you would prefer the Myanmar junta not to interfere with the open internet?
Yeah, we'd prefer for consumers to be able to access the platforms they choose and to be able to express their voice the way they need to and the way they want to, openly and freely.
What about the case now of India, where the Indian government claims that you're breaking the law, and they asked you to close down a whole series of accounts which they argue are inflammatory? You push back, you close it down initially, but now you've reinstated a whole lot of them. So what is your argument for saying that no, you're not breaking the law, or that why it is more important to have these accounts open?
Look, we're always engaging in the case of the farmers' protests in India. We're engaging very respectfully, and we want to continue to engage very respectfully with the Indian government. I think one of the things that we also hold as a responsibility of ours is to enable and support freedom of expression for the users in India. And that's essentially the core debate at the moment. When it comes to making sure that accounts that are incredibly important in terms of voices are lawfully allowed in market, whether it's politicians or journalists, we believe that there is, even within the Indian law, we believe that there is room for the voices of these people to be heard. And that's the conversation we're engaging with the Indian government.
Well, the difficulty, though, is sometimes, we're talking about it as if all governments are legitimate. But not all governments are legitimate. Some of them aren't democratically elected. In the case of, let's say, Myanmar, what's going on now, it's a military takeover. So when they throw the rule book at you, it's not actually a rule book that was voted on by the public. So how do you deal with that? In the sense that on the one hand, it claims to be a law, but on the other hand, it's being enforced by a non-democratic government.
Yeah, I will say that's the complexity of the world we live in today, right? And we've stated our concern around the fact that we don't believe the internet should be shut down at every instance, and we'll continue to fight that fight and continue to express our deep concern around the threat to the open internet system, which we deeply believe in.
What about analysts who say, but Twitter, has all these high-minded, ideals of freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But at the end of it, isn't really about turning a profit, having large sales, and that is what really drives any big tech company.
I will say that I won't comment for the whole industry, but I'll talk about us. Our principle is always uniting purpose and profit. And I don't necessarily think that we're in a place where we're only choosing one or the other. Absolutely not. I feel privileged to be a leader in a company where purpose is as important and is absolutely core to why we exist. And every employee in the company will tell you this.
So would you take a knock on profit? In other words, would you take a knock on your revenues just to uphold a principle? Ethical principle?
I will give you examples of when we've done that, when it's been right to do that. But I'll also tell you that we just announced earnings coming out of a pandemic year, and I'll talk about international revenues because we're sitting here in Asia. Our international revenues grew 34% year on year. We've had a really strong revenue cadence, and I'll tell you why I'm saying that. It's because not always are you at the crossroads of trading off profit and purpose. You can actually be purposeful and grow the business in very healthy ways from a revenue standpoint. I'll give you one example. Many months ago, we actually turned off political advertising on the platform, right? And so I think this is one that we feel very comfortable saying that we never give up our purpose, but we of course are a listed stock. We're a public company. And profit is certainly a part of our equation, but not always do we have to trade it off. And when we do, we will choose the thing that makes us sleep at night better.
So who is the customer in the end for Twitter? Is it the users? Is it your advertisers? Who is the customer? Who do you have Twitter for?
Look, ultimately, our customer our allegiance is to our users, right? It is just the nature of the fact that our users are on the platform. There's swaths of communities that engage in a public conversation around topics they really deeply care about. And it's because they're there that there is value created in being able
that you exist.
That I exist, yeah. And that we're able to create these moments of connection for other brands to be able to play out their purpose, to be able to provide their services to the users. But it's very hard to find an example where we would trade off what's right for the user in order to achieve an advertising outcome.
So how do I know how much I'm revealing when I actually do a tweet?
The fact that you've chosen to tweet publicly means that content of what you said in a tweet is something that's out there for people to see. And really, an advertiser is interested in what your interests are at a larger consolidated level, not necessarily you, Lynn, particularly personally, what do I know about you? But rather, if you've tweeted a lot about technology or news, then we know that you are someone who loves that and you're part of this whole group. One of the things that we are very careful about is how much information we ask of you when you set up your account. And that's intentional, right? We want you to only be able to give the data that you really feel comfortable sharing and no more. So we build the safeguards of a consumer's privacy in there from the very get-go.
What about governments who come to you and say, I need more information about it? You can actually trace where this person tweeted from, right down to the last, exactly when, and probably from the tweets, you could give a pattern even of their behavior. We'd like you to disclose that to us.
Well, if you know, we always do a transparency report, and our intention is always to be completely transparent with the world on what data we're being asked. But in general, our user data is incredibly important and private to us. It's the one that we protect utmost in all of our efforts, and that's always been, that's consistently true.
So do I understand you to mean you'd say no to the government, that they won't get this information from you?
Anything that is asked of us is also reported in the transparency report, which then becomes a good check and balance for us around the world to say, here is something out in public domain for people to know, for NGOs to know, for academics to know, for us as an industry to know, if we've been asked for those types of information.
If we look now to what's going to happen in 2021, there are going to be some pretty crucial elections, also here in Asia, taking place. How do you prep for that? How do you make sure that an election, let's say that may take place in Malaysia, or one that might take place in Thailand for the governor of Bangkok, which is a very crucial post, how do you make sure that everybody gets a fair say in what appears on Twitter?
Being in Asia, every year is an election year, right? And it's not just one, it's many, and it's at state levels and gubernatorial elections and more. So it's always an election year here. But a typical approach that we would do, our teams would actually set up a playing field around getting as many voices heard that are important and that need to be heard for the constituents, users on the platform. And so we've done, for instance, in the past, we've done things like setting up live streaming sessions, what would normally be a town square and something on a public speaker. In some of our countries, we've actually done labels for candidates who go into an election, so people know that this is someone who has something to say and will be participating in the elections. So those are the parts in proactively as we prep to go into an election. Then we actually partner with wide variety of media companies, news sources, etc., because we want to give our users every side of the story as the election starts to play out. And then we actually come to monitoring things like, is the election integrity going well? And are people claiming that there's a victory in an election before it's actually been called? Things like that.
Do you think Twitter ought to be regulated by governments, or it should be self-regulating?
We're a tech company, and we build a lot of technology that sometimes a government or a regulator may not at first immediately understand. And what we think could be helpful or interesting is that regulation should take an approach on thinking about the rules to play by on the inputs. Often regulators will regulate the outputs, but you may lose some interesting advantages that technology is set up with in that process. So we're not opposed to it, but we would love to see a way in which regulation is standardized across markets, to have a global policy or a regional policy rather than one that's fragmented country by country by country. And we'd also love to see regulation in a way where inputs from different parts of society are taken while constructing that.
Can technology actually ever be neutral? Isn't it always an ethical choice at some point?
There's so much value to be had with technology. Now, with that value and with that scale and reach comes responsibility. And I think our ambition and our hope and our approach is always to show every side of the story. Let me give you an example of how this has shaped our evolution as a company. We used to be all about following accounts and learning what that person was tweeting about or was saying. In the last year or a little bit more than that, we have introduced following topics. And this was something that we realized over time is a great way to be able to fulfill that promise of saying, see every side of that story. Because if me as someone who believes in climate change is following climate change, I'm not only getting a one-sided point of view from a person that I follow. I'm actually now getting all voices, and I'm getting context on how to make my own decisions and own choices. And I think that's where we see the future of our platform, where we want to be able to provide as much context to a consumer and be able to do that responsibly with showing every side of the story, but ultimately letting the consumer feel like they have control over making that right decision and walking away with that content that they want to see.
Maya Hari, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you.